What's up, everybody? I hope that George enjoys his theme song. So you want to get right to the core. So you want to know what it's all for. So you want to come off knowing more. Well, you better get hip to Podcast by George. So you want to get straight to the show. So you want to know what you need to know. You want to know what we're all here for. Well, you better get hip to Podcast by George. Podcast by George. Podcast by George. He knows what he's fighting for. It's Podcast by George. Podcast by George. Want to know what we're fighting for?
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Thanks, as always, Ron Placone, for that musical intro. You know, I've actually heard from some folks that'll tell me, they say, you know, that guy's not a very good singer. I don't particularly like that song. They're kind of missing the point. It's kind of half joke. It's kind of half real. Ron Placone's a touring comedian out in California, and that's a spiff that he provides people to join his Patreon. You get your theme song. So he made up one for Podcast by George. You can get one too. Just go to ronplacone.com and sign up on his Patreon, and you can get one. So that's the opening for this edition of Podcast by George. We got a really good one today, folks. We got a couple of guests that are very esteemed. I mean, they're heroes of mine. So I hope I don't mess this up. I got a lot of stuff to show and talk about, and a lot of technical things we're going to try to get on here production wise. And of course, I'm the host, but I'm also the producer, the director. I'm the gaffer. I'm the grip. I do all of this stuff. So let's hope that this goes all right. Let's bring this first graphic up on screen and give a little background for our first guest. We're going to have both Gerald Posner and also the great Matthew Hoh on this particular show. And Gerald Posner, for folks that may not know it, he's an author of at least 13 acclaimed books, including the New York Times nonfiction bestsellers, Case Closed, Why America Slept, and God's Bankers. He is a contributor to Forbes, and we're going to be talking about his most recent contribution to Forbes today a little bit more at length. Now, Gerald was a finalist for the Pulitzer in history, for God's sake. The New York Times said his latest book from 2020, Pharma, and I want to show these on screen also. Now, this is a lineup of his books, but this Pharma book got rave reviews. It's his most current, and folks ought to check this out. I mean, get a copy of this and read it, because I talk all the time about climate war and healthcare, and particularly how the military-industrial complex is to blame or is responsible for who we are as citizens of humanity. Well, Gerald would look at it and say, pharma, big pharma in this country has a lot to do with who we are and maybe even who we are not. So that's his most recent book. Let me move things around here a little bit, get that off screen, jump down here, and to bring him on in here and get it up to where it's big enough that people can see it and say good morning to our friend Gerald Posner.
Hey, great to be with you again, George.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show. Now we're gonna be this is gonna be a little different. So I'm gonna bring Matthew Hoh's bio up here and talk about this. People have seen him on my show a lot. He's running for the U.S. Senate out in the Green Party in North Carolina. He spent 10 years in the Marine Corps and went to war 3 times before he says he realized the courage to stand against those unjust, immoral, and counterproductive wars. Now, since 2009, Matt Hoh has been against what he describes as the systemic, political, and financial rot. I always like that, financial, systemic, political, and financial rot that underlies and connects our problems in North Carolina, the United States, and beyond. And now he returns to the podcast by George. This is a very special show. Let's get him in here. And there he is. There's a little thumbnail, and say hello to our good friend, Matthew Hoh.
Hey, George, thanks for having me back. And Gerald, it's a pleasure to be on this with you.
Yeah, great to meet you, Matt, as well. Really a pleasure.
Well, and, you know, I always like to deal with topical things to start with as much as possible anyway. And here's our thirds. I don't know exactly which format is going to be the best for this. It might be this one. Let's see here. Let me do this. Well, okay, let's play around with this a little bit. I wanted to start with Gerald because the topical news of the day is this Salman Rushdie guy. This horrific attack on him, which shocked a lot of people. But Gerald's got a Substack now, like a lot of people do. It allows him to respond very quickly and write very quickly about current events. And he's written on Substack about this. And Gerald, I would guess that maybe you're not as shocked about this, and kind of tell us a little bit about what's in the Substack this morning.
Yeah, George, I don't think I am. I'm shocked in the sense that we always were hoping that nobody would attack Rushdie, physically try to kill him. But people who followed Iran for years aren't surprised in this sense. In the West, we tended to think it's so old. It's 33 years old since the Ayatollah had issued this fatwa, this decree to kill Rushdie because his novel, was considered blasphemous by the Ayatollah against Islam. And they had offered at the time, over a $2 million reward. We thought, oh, it's stale, it's forgotten about. But it wasn't. The Japanese translator of the book had been attacked and killed. The Norwegian publisher had been shot. The Italian translator had been stabbed in his own apartment. We forget about the early days. Rushdie's life was turned upside down. He moved 56 times with police protection just in the first 6 months after it was issued. He didn't come out of hiding for the first 6 years, and then limited public appearances. But in Iran, what they did is they gave us publicly the idea that it was over. As early as 98, the president of Iran said, you know what? Don't worry, we're not doing anything about it. The foreign minister told the British ambassador at the UN, it's forgotten about, it's over. But that was window dressing. They were trying to improve relations at the time. And the hardliners behind the scenes, and I talk about this in the Substack piece, were adding 200,000, 300,000, 500,000, these religious groups and media groups to the reward. So it built up to 3.3 million. And they kept pushing for it all the time. And then in 2019, the current supreme leader of the country, Ayatollah Khamenei, he actually retweeted for the first time and made the fatwa public again after all those years and put it on Twitter, of all places. And what was Twitter's great response? I mean, you're on Twitter, I'm on Twitter. We're there actively. We look for some guidance occasionally on issues that should be important. And a death threat from a reiteration of the fatwa against Rushdie by the supreme leader of Iran, you would think would be one of those things that Twitter would be up in arms about. And what did it do? It said, we're suspending your account. You can't post anymore. Your account will still stay active. You can't put up any more tweets until you take down that threat. He didn't take it down. Tens of thousands of retweets. So finally, after 3 days, Twitter said, okay, you're back up and running. And they deleted the tweet themselves. But by then it was too late. So anybody that thinks it was over with had to look at the celebrations by the hardliners in Iran last night. One of the major newspapers published a picture of Rushdie on a stretcher under the headline, Satan is on the path to hell. So unfortunately, for those of us who followed it, it's bad news, but it's not a surprise. The hardliners kept this death threat open and running for 3 decades plus.
I'm getting little indications here that our Wi-Fi connection is in and out. I think the audio is streaming well, so I encourage people to listen along. It looks like it's coming back now. This must really have, those images that you talked about must freak you out a little bit, because this dude's on stage talking about his books. I mean, this is something you've done a lot. I mean, did that strike home to you?
No, I mean, look, at any writer who does investigative work, we get... depending on the subject that we're writing about at times, some strange emails and some possible threats. And I had reported years ago on the Kennedy book, threats that we thought were dangerous enough to open up a police file at the time. It's part and parcel, but you don't have the head of a fundamentalist Islamic state, the religious leader, issued a fatwa. Fatwa is not on its own a death decree. It was in this instance. It's a religious edict by the supreme leader that has to be followed. And so once that's issued, you have a mark on you that you think is there forever. And it only takes one fanatic to try to fulfill that. That's the problem. 90% of Iranians can say, I'm not interested in that. It's not something I'm going to do. As a Shia Muslim, I'm not going against this Muslim writer. Rushdie is Muslim himself, in England, for having said something that the Ayatollah thought was blasphemous. But that's the problem with an order like this. It just takes one crazed person to try to fulfill it. And so it's always a great worry.
Yeah, it also reminded me of Malcolm X. The other thing about it is, and I follow the news pretty closely, and I've been putting the show together this morning. Now, last I heard, he was on a ventilator.
Yeah, I'm only going by the public reports on that. I haven't spoken to anybody in his circle, and all I know is that you hear the reports, and it looked as though the attacker was hitting him or punching him 10 to 15 times, and he had a sharp object or a knife of some type. We know he was hit in the neck and the liver, and it's never good. But all of our thoughts are with Rushdie, who has had to live with this for all this time, and that he will be able to survive and somehow recover. But it's not good news coming out so far.
Well, both of our guests have very compelling perspectives to share on a number of topics today, and Matthew Hoh does as well. Now, Matt, you've been over there. I mean, you've lived in these cultures of the Middle East. You were deployed over there 3 times, and the point that I make to people all the time about this U.S. Action in the Middle East, these things that we do, these cultures, they've got very long memories. Gerald talked about that. They don't forget. They remember generationally. And so something that happens that we tend to walk away from, that Americans, as we are, have very short attention spans about, they don't. They remember. Oh, Matt, your mic didn't come back on.
No, my dog was acting up. My dog was acting up, so I didn't.
That's okay.
I mean, that's the human race, though, right? I mean, we all have long memories. We all have a generational history. And the reality is that history is not that far back, right? History is always much closer than we may realize it to be. I think I've told this story before on your show. I can't remember, George, but, when I was in the Pentagon, and one of the times I spoke with Don Rumsfeld, and I was a captain in the Marine Corps. So he was just being polite to me. And he said to myself and my friend, behind us was a portrait of Eisenhower. And he said, "You know how old I am? I used to work with that guy. That's how old I am."
Yeah.
And, history is not that far back. And of course, Eisenhower, when he was a young officer, he knew Civil War officers, right? Because when he was graduating from the military academy in the 1910s, these guys were still around. I mean, so history is never as far back as we think it is. So when we talk about things like, say, the modern history of Iran, it's not how many generations removed since the coup in 1953, right? Since the British occupation. I mean, there's no reason why that should still not be in living memory, and why that should not either legitimately animate people or at least provide the basis for their grievance, particularly the hardliners. So, I think a lot of this, and there's value. Sometimes I think that our hardliners get together with their hardliners and, come up with different ways they can help each other and enable each other, right? I mean, so that the pushback is available. So, we're going to sail our, right? I mean, this idea that there are folks in any country who benefit from conflict, who benefit from divisiveness, who benefit from hatred, who benefit from, the clash of civilizations. So what I find interesting about the timing of this with the Rushdie attack, it also comes out, it occurs at the same time. And I do hope he is okay. And this is really quite horrific and frightening. And I think a lot of us had thought that this was over. I mean, I don't recall the Ayatollah Khamenei's tweet from 2013, but I feel like I hadn't heard about this in a very long time. Yeah. And, so I hope he is okay and will recover. But the timing is interesting just because of the supposed assassination plot against John Bolton and potentially Mike Pompeo, as well as, the continuing negotiations with Iran over the nuclear treaty. So the timing is always sometimes timing is I guess seems more than coincidental. I'm sure that's all it is in this case, is coincidental, but certainly These are things that history doesn't stop. We live in a continuous line of history, and this is the reality of it. And this is why I think it's so imperative that we work to put a brake on those things that are driving particular lines of history, because otherwise it just continues to evolve and build upon itself. And I hope Rushdie is able to recover. And this really is a horrific thing. And you have to, like, as you mentioned with Gerald, this is a risk that anyone in the public eye, who does any type of work that some elements are going to consider as an affront or as a danger to them. This is a real risk. And then we just saw what happened with that guy trying to shoot up the FBI building.
Yeah.
So we live, I think this idea of with Rushdie, there are elements to it that resound throughout our society, domestically as through our foreign policy. And I think it's a really telling story.
Well, I've got to move off of this because we've got so many other things to talk about. But before we do, I wanted to talk, because that poster is in your background there. I want to talk about Julian Assange just briefly, because anybody that looks at this Rushdie thing, God, is it horrific, this video? Well, I mean, you could very easily, if you're a warmonger, a war hawk, you could look at that and say, my God, these people are barbaric. We need to go over there and give them some enlightenment at the tip of a spear. We need to act on this. Well, I would encourage them to think about what's happening to Julian Assange, what we're doing in this country to him as an example. You talked about plots against John Bolton. It's been revealed there are plots by our intelligence agencies against Julian Assange. It's not exactly the same, but it's enough alike that I think we need to be considerate in our approach to this.
Well, I think in general, are the civil liberties issues we face. The continuance of a domestic surveillance program by law enforcement and intelligence agencies in the United States against the American public. That goes back through 3 presidents now. This goes back through, George W. Bush administration and the warrantless wiretap order that they had in effect that Thomas Tam revealed in 2007. And Tam being, I think it was 2007 when it was finally revealed. Certainly these issues, again, extend beyond just the singular name that's tied to it. And so certainly what's happening with Assange, or what happened with Chelsea Manning, or say even what happened with, John Kiriakou or Thomas Drake or other types of, or other whistleblowers. These are certainly issues that are much larger than the individuals and can have major consequences for our society in terms of, our civil liberties and our press freedoms.
Yeah, Matt and George, I understand what you're saying about Assange and Chelsea Manning and everything else. I get that, but I do think you have to separate. It's apples and oranges. Otherwise, the Rushdie event, you had the religious leader of the revolution in '89 come out with a death edict for a sovereign country, and then since then, it's the revolutionary divisions of the government, the 15th Cordon Foundation, that added $500,000 to the bounty in '97. It was religious groups that added another 300,000. Media groups, state media groups, brought it up to 3.3 million. The reiteration of the public threat by the current supreme leader of the country. So, no, we're not going to rush over and have a war, George. You're right, against Iran, and sanctions have cost them $200 billion, but doesn't seem to be stopping them. But my point is that, this is the type of thing that when a country sanctions its highest leaders, and the religious leaders are the supreme rulers of the country, and they ban the 83 million citizens from using YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, although they use it for their own tweets, it's a different situation. I mean, my condemnation for all of it runs across the board, but in this particular case, I'm incensed by the fact that a sovereign country has encouraged possibly this act that took place the other day, and they'll get away with it.
Well, thanks for that perspective. I've got to move off of Salman Rushdie. I want to talk about another topical item here that I wanted your insight on too, Gerald, and that is the Mar-a-Lago situation with these confidential top secret documents. Now, you've spent a lot of your adult life as an author, this work that you do with these books, trying to get access to documents that are often sealed, often confidential, top secret, that type of thing. Do you have any idea? I mean, what just maybe is your overall impression of what's happening down there? And it's supposedly, again, about top secret documents. How worried should we be about that?
And there's a lawyer, I'm a lawyer in another life, it seems like.
Yeah.
I for freedom of information documents, and I have battles with the government over confidential documents. In this case, we're dealing with an unusual situation because we're dealing with an ex-president, and there's never been a legal determination as to whether the president has a right to declassify documents on his or her own, or on documents of national security. They have to first be in consultation with the DNI, the Defense intelligence groups, or the CIA. That's not clear. We may get this resolved eventually. I don't immediately jump into one corner on the right or left. I'm not somebody on the right who's saying, oh, this is a terrible thing. How could this be done with this search warrant? And on the other hand, I'm not somebody who believes that, oh my God, we have an espionage case like the Rosenbergs here brewing. I want the facts. This is what I always say, the name of my Substack is just the facts. The facts are going to be eventually in that affidavit that was submitted to the judge that had the judge sign off on the search warrant. If the facts support a case for top secret documents being held and withheld or destroyed at the Trump compound, then that's going to be one of the big stories of our time. And if the facts in that particular affidavit don't stand up to scrutiny, it'll be one of the great scandals of our time that search was pulled off. So we will find out. We don't know yet. We're watching history play out as it takes place. I'm amazed, George, and I don't know how you feel about this, Matt, that so much airtime on cable TV and on news channels is consumed with speculation. We just don't know yet what the information, and just everybody wants to speculate about what it might be. It's fantastic, but get lost in that is the rest of the news that's happening in the world. So it would be great to cover Mar-a-Lago, the ex-president, the search warrant, and also find out what else is going on in the world. But we tend to be one topic at a time. We get consumed by it, even if we don't really have any basic information to draw the conclusions yet that we need to draw.
Yeah, I saw on Twitter people, reputable people saying he had that stuff down there and was going to sell it for money. Like, my God, that's a leap of faith. How do you get there?
I'm so careful in my own work at drawing the line between what I know, I can prove, what I have a source for versus my own speculation. I try to keep that out. But people, good, reputable people, you're right, news sources sometimes pass along speculation as though it's fact. And, I always say, somebody will say to me, what do you think about that? And I'll say, I don't know. I'm waiting for the facts. But that seems an old-fashioned view nowadays when everybody seems to have drawn a conclusion within 30 seconds of hearing the headline.
Now, that said, I gotta admit, when this first broke, my bat sense, my tingle went off, Matt, because I'm thinking, and people have talked about the weaponization of the DOJ and the political hijinks and that type of thing. And you just have had some firsthand experience with what moves in the political spheres. My God, could this really be just political? There does appear to be something more to it at this point. But, I mean, what's your sense? Do you think it's political or something more than that?
I think there's something there. I don't. They tend to surprise you at times, our political leaders, by how ham-fisted or how they misjudge things and screw things up, But I don't think. Look, if there's nothing there, they've somehow been able to make Donald Trump into a victim, which is a remarkable feat if you're able to do that, right?
Yeah.
This is a guy who probably should have been raided by the FBI every day for the last 40 years for one reason or another. I think we've all seen, as a speculation, there's so many different actual investigations going on right now into him and criminality that it could be 5 or 6 different reasons. But now, as we understand from the events of the last day or so, related possibly to this possession of classified information. And here's one of the things: if it is top secret information, we're not going to know what that is. Unless that document gets leaked, it's not going to show up on CNN or Fox or MSNBC or in the Times, the Post, the Journal, whatever. So it's always going to be an amount of speculation to it in terms of actually what it was. And I think this, again, you can get into other larger issues of classification of the Espionage Act, which supposedly there are potential charges under the Espionage Act that would relate to Donald Trump and his possession, and how terrible in general the Espionage Act is. Yeah, we'll have to, I guess, wait and see what the there is, if there is a there, to reference the famous go back 25 years or so. But yeah, I mean, I think just the spectacle of it, and certainly, I mean, these are smart people who understand the consequences of sending the FBI into Mar-a-Lago is that you're setting off something here, and that you've upped the fight now. You've really, and the fact that the midterms are less than 3 months away, this is no surprise. I mean, like, in the sense of that, this type of conflict is good for both sides. Kind of like what I was saying before about the hardliners in Iran and in the United States. This attack on Rushdie benefits hardliners in both countries. Like the supposed assassination attempt on Pompeo and Bolton benefits hardliners in both sides. I mean, and so this type of the FBI going into Mar-a-Lago, this benefits, Democrats and Republicans, and we'll see what actually shakes out in terms of who actually gets the political value from it.
Matt, it's interesting because David Brooks, the New York Times editorial writer, had a column the other day I recommend people take a look at. You may or may not agree with it. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with it. It is that the FBI just reelected Trump. I don't think he's right on that, but coming from Brooks, it's an intriguing piece. And the question, when you mentioned, we talk about documents that could be, an espionage charge, and you see that in the warrant. And I think to myself, this is a fellow in Trump, a president who was notorious for not listening to the morning intelligence briefs. He wouldn't pay attention.
Right.
He didn't read the documents. He's not a reader. He doesn't read books. He may not have even read the documents that we're talking about that are there, but, thought that there were documents that he could collect. I'm sure he wasn't thinking of making one of his own missiles that he might be able to send into some place, and develop it. But the best conspiracy theory I had was from somebody who wrote to me who said, is it possible that the source of the information for which the affidavit could be relied upon, whether it was a Secret Service person or someone else in the Trump entourage, was a setup, so that the DOJ was essentially set up? They said, by the way, there's a real smoking gun document here, and it happened to be in this closet. Got them excited enough to be able to do the search, and it turns out there's nothing there. Now, again, who knows? But hopefully we will find out. You're absolutely right when you say we'll never see the document, which will be top secret, but I think that the pressure will be on for DOJ to release at least a redacted form of the affidavit. And that would be fascinating to find out what the basis was for doing a search. Look, it's a big step, as you said before, George. Is a politicization of the of DOJ? We don't know until we see what the basis was. I don't think of the Attorney General as somebody who makes rash decisions, but we all need a little bit more information.
I'll let my freak flag fly a little bit here, bring up my left-wing perspective. I'm going to bring this up on screen. This is from my good friend, Ron Placone. Yeah, Matt's been on his show before. Again, he's got a kind of a knack for summing things up like this. He says, Trump is a douche canoe. I love that. He's a douche canoe. The FBI is not your friend, nor are they ever on your side. The Espionage Act is a terrible thing. All of the above is true, and no, it really isn't that complicated. Okay, that kind of sums it up for me. Before we let you go on this topic, Gerald, how much of this do you think it is a possibility that they're just wanting to cover their own asses like they did in the JFK stuff, where they just don't want something that they've done revealed inadvertently by boxes of crap that Trump has? Is that a possibility?
It's a possibility, but I don't think they're going to be able to do it as easily. Now, this is a different country, than it was in 1964 when the Warren Commission issued its report. I don't think people would today accept the Warren Commission report so easily. They didn't in large part anyway, but there would be a vocal outrage against it in its conclusions. And so today, I think that, and it's what Matt said before, how it benefits both sides, the far ends of the extreme sort of get energized about something like this. They're going to be pushing on their own to find out more. You're going to have the far left saying, we want the confirmation that Trump's really guilty of treason. And you're going to have the far right saying, we want the information to show that this was a political abuse by the FBI and that the Attorney General should resign. Somewhere along the drumbeat, I think that we will see enough evidence to have the public make up their own minds about it.
And you know, it just propels us with this status quo of, you know, because you've already heard from Republicans that if they gain control of the House, they're going to launch investigations into the Justice Department, the White House. You know, Trump and his I don't know if it's his attorney, but spokesperson for Trump is claiming that Trump had this standing order that anything he took out of the White House was immediately declassified, which is probably complete nonsense. But it just allows for the fight to go on in perpetuity, right? It just this you know, and there are people who will, you know, if you were to unravel all of this, the genesis of it, this predates Donald Trump. This goes back to, people will point, you know, and show you, well, this happened and that happened. The Republicans did this, then the Democrats did that, and you unravel it, and you get back to, you know, Whitewater and the Clintons. You know, I mean, so what we're seeing here is this political maneuvering, theater, stunts, whatever, that may or may not have actually substance behind it. And again, I have no idea what Trump will be doing with those documents. I mean, the things I saw about nuclear weapons and about something about the president of France. I can't imagine he's reading that in the evening while he's eating a Big Mac or something. You know, I don't know what he would be doing with that stuff, but you know, we'll see. But we're certainly, I do know that this will, as Gerald said, this will fill up CNN, the Times opinion page, etc., until the next act of you know, theater comes along. And
you know, there's something interesting about that, Matt. You understand this. You're a Green Party member. You're trying to run against the two parties and running for Congress. And to the extent that the two parties take up all the oxygen in these fights that take place back and forth, they talk about investigating each other all the time. I'm going to take control of Congress, and I'm going to open up investigations against this part. No, we're going to keep Congress and keep investigating this. It's distractions. You don't get to the real issues. You don't get to discuss the underlying things that most Americans are really affected by. And you're shunted on the outside. And what happens is, of course, it becomes just Democrats and Republicans. And if you, as a Green Party member or any other third party member, tries to come up and say, by the way, that's all bull, I want to talk about this issue, even if the public catches on and starts to follow that issue that you're talking about, the parties will try to co-opt it and eventually say, by the way, don't vote for him. He can't win. Remember, he's not a Republican or a Democrat, so he can't really win. You've got to vote for one of us, and we're on top of his issue anyway. So it's this, you know, process in which they make sure that the fight stays an intra-party fight between the two of them. And although they're at each other's throats often, it is all to the benefit of retaining power between those major two parties and making sure that nobody else challenges them for it.
Okay, sorry, our show's half over. I hate to do this, but I want to move to Afghanistan, but very briefly, we got to mention, because you talked about Matt's candidacy just yesterday, Matt. The last legal hurdle now has been overcome. I mean, you're over it. You are on the ballot. We don't have to worry about legal stuff anymore in your case.
It's not the last legal hurdle. We still have North Carolina Democratic Party has a lawsuit in state court. But what happened this past week was the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals denied the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee's motion for a stay on last week's district court order that had put us on the ballot. And this goes back months now, our fight with the State Board of Elections. We had to disprove all kinds of just baseless and spurious allegations of fraud. You know, we finally defeat that. We get certified, but then we have to be in federal court in order to get the deadlines moved so that we can be on the ballot. And then the appeal by the DSCC. So the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals denied the DSCC's motion to stay the district court order, which means that as of now, because the ballot printing deadline was yesterday for North Carolina, myself and Michael Trudeau are on the ballot in November. But the legal stuff is still going to continue. We still have this state court issue. We still have the appeal in federal court. I'm certain if they lose that appeal, the DSCC will try and go to the Supreme Court. And we expect this to go on for possibly a number of years. Because they're just the idea of having competition, the idea of another option. And Gerald, you said so well, explained it very, very well, what we're up against. And what we want to do is, we want to talk about healthcare. We want to talk about housing. We want to talk about jobs. We want to talk about climate. And we do. You know, even these last couple months dealing with this, we've been unable to speak to those things because the narrative has been this legal fight, this fight to get on the ballot, these allegations of fraud, so it's a closed system that seeks to keep power in power, and it fights like hell against anything that might threaten it.
And that's so interesting. I mean, I'm sorry, George, but I wrote a book back in '96 on Ross Perot. It was an authorized biography in the sense that he gave my wife and me, we spent hours and hours and hours with him in Dallas, his second presidential run. After the book was published, he didn't talk to me any longer. I'd like to have sort of their story told. I told the story warts and all. He's a patriotic American. But the part of that story that's so relevant for what we're talking about here today is the extent to which the two parties underestimated the impact he would have at first. So they let him into the first presidential debate. And then as a result, he garnered all types of public support. They'll never make that mistake again. Now, of course, to get into a presidential debate, you have to be polling at a certain number. So they've made that much more difficult. They kept that just within the two of them. And then they set out to be able to undermine him and portray him as crazy, unreliable. He fed into some of that, so he let it happen. But what you said a moment ago, when you were telling George about the appeals, the efforts to get on the ballot, the average American has no idea how difficult a process this is. The hurdles, the blocks that are put in front of a third party or any legitimate candidacy to try to get on the ballot and have an alternative choice. It is not simple, and it varies state by state. The rules are different. You literally have to spend millions of dollars if you want to be on all 50 state ballots running for the presidency. So people think all you have to do is raise your hand. You're Ralph Nader and you say, oh, by the way, I'm running for the Green Party, and you're on all 50 state ballots and people can then go out and vote for you. No, it's a really arduous process made so by the state legislatures and the electors who are Republicans and Democrats who make sure it's an insider's game.
Right. And Ballotpedia keeps track of all this. And last year, the average ballot initiative in the United States cost over $2 million. And that's for people trying to get on the ballot to run as a candidate, have a party recognized. Maybe it's a place like California or Oregon where a ballot referendum is taking place, right? But it's $2 million is the average. And the average last year for a cost of one signature was $14. We ended up costing us about $2 down here when we did the math. We ended up spending about $50,000 to get onto the ballot, and almost, 90 some odd % of our people were volunteers. Right. And it still costs us that much money because it's so labor intensive. It's so time intensive to go out there and collect tens of thousands of signatures, and it exhausts you. And if you're an independent or third party or grassroots campaign or candidate, it's incredibly difficult. And then on the backside of that, you then have to face all the administrative, bureaucratic, and legal challenges like we've been. We've got we're both in state court and in federal court. And this is not unusual. This is what happens. Maybe some aspects of what occurred to us are unique. The brazenness of some of the efforts by the DSCC in this are kind of jaw-dropping. However, the overall circumstances of having to spend the better part of a year just trying to get onto the ballot and then having to go into 2 different courts to do it after we had done it, did everything necessary, got all this, got all the signatures, met all the deadlines, everything procedurally correct. And still, so it is, that's the nature of the system. And, the American experience with third parties in the United States, it gets pushed away and shut away. If you went up to many people and you said, asked what % of votes did George Wallace get in 1968? People be shocked that he got, I think, 11%, or no, maybe more than that, 12%. And Perot got 19. John Anderson got 7% in 1980. These are all things that are kind of suppressed from the current political commentary in order to make it seem that independents or third parties are not viable, when in fact they are. And what happens is that the system then co-opts them or just suppresses them. And it really is. It's a real form of voter suppression.
And Matt, it's interesting because the 19.8 that 20% Perot got was after he had dropped out of the race and then sort of come back in. It would have been higher even.
That's right
about that. And the Bush people, Bush the elder, like to say, oh, he cost us the election because, of course, it elected Clinton. But the exit polls on that election show that he drew evenly for both. He took away Bush voters, he took away Clinton voters because he had a cross appeal. Now, Perot believed, as many did, you could win outside of the two parties, but he thought that if he ran inside either the Republicans or the Democrats, he would be chopped up. And that was
Hello,
true.
Bernie.
So Bernie, right? Always trying to do it. But in some ways, that was the shock of Trump. Putting aside, how you feel about Trump, he ran inside an established political party. He didn't do it as a third party run because he knew that you had to get a party nomination to really be a player. Mm-hmm. And he did a hostile takeover, in essence, of the Republican Party at that time to everyone's shock, to the shock of Cruz and to the shock of all those Republicans running against him who thought that they could push him out by just saying he's not a real Republican. He's really a former Democrat who's sort of come over to the Republican Party, doesn't believe in real conservatism, and he'd never get the nomination. So here was a case in which somebody who we would have thought of as a third party candidate, because he didn't fit into one of the real molds of the major two parties. He wasn't a corporate Democrat or a corporate Republican, came in and grabbed the nomination and shows very well that you do need one of the two parties behind you to win the White House.
I'll tell you what else.
Go ahead, George.
No, I was going to say, when it comes to Perot, as Gerald mentioned, he had issues, but this guy was on some issues too. History reflects very favorably upon him when it comes to NAFTA, the giant sucking sound. He had that quote. He was anti-war. Obviously, he was right about that. I think he was also on the right side of the gay marriage issue. A lot of things like that. I remember his candidacy very well. I liked him. But I knew that his candidacy was doomed, and not for any of the issues that you might think. I knew that he would never be president when I saw him on the debate stage with Bill Clinton and George Bush, because, I don't know, Gerald, if maybe this is in your book, but the guy was 5'5" tall. And being as cynical as I am about America, I thought, hell, they're never going to elect a guy that's 5'5". I'm 5'7". I ain't going to be president. He was a very small man physically. And people, look at Reagan and the Hollywood and Trump with his damn television show and all that type of stuff. I just didn't think that was going to work. And I don't know how big a factor that was. But
don't tell that to Emmanuel Macron, who I think.
He's a little guy. Yeah.
He's beat a lot of taller candidates over in France twice now.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. All right. Let me get onto this now, because this is the real genesis, the reason for the show. I want to bring this up on screen. This is this article in Forbes just this week. And Gerald's a contributor to Forbes. And this is something that Matt and I have talked about extensively on the show. And we talked about this news flow Gerald did about how it tends to be off kilter and dwarf the real issues of the day. This is a real issue of the day that every American should be concerned about. And it is the cost of the Afghan war. And it isn't getting better. It's getting worse. The title of this in Forbes: how much U.S. money did departing Afghan officials steal? How much cash fits on a helicopter? And I want people to, get a visual. I tell people, think about a stack of $100 bills that runs from Des Moines to Omaha. All right, think about that. We're going to get to that in a little bit. Let me bring this up again. It says, when President Ashraf Ghani and his top aides fled Afghanistan on a fleet of 4 helicopters last August, what happened to the millions of dollars in U.S. and cash that they took with them? That's the question investigated for the past year. Now, these highlights are mine, Gerald. You can jump in here at this point. They looked at this thing for a year, and this was a dud, it looks to me like. How did they look at it that long, and how were they not able to come up with some conclusions?
And, it's a good group that looks at it. Matt knows them. As the Office of the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan has uncovered tons of fraud over there at times, and this systemic fraud of the Afghan government under several regimes, under Karzai and then under Ghani. As they said, it's hard to trace cash. That's why cash is valued so much by people who don't want to be on the radar. They had to rely on eyewitnesses, some of them former Afghan officials who were loyal to President Ghani. They had to rely on those accounts. But we, as the public, as investigators, as reporters, as politicians, can't judge the accuracy or the motivation of those witnesses because they asked for anonymity. and the American investigators gave it to them. So we just have a bunch of anonymous sort of eyewitness accounts at the end about what they saw on that flea the day before the Taliban took Kabul on 4 helicopters, specially equipped Soviet VIP helicopters that the President Ghani and his entourage had. The Russians say they took $169 million out in cash. Well, Matt's been involved in distributing some of that cash, as he'll tell you, in Iraq and Afghanistan. That would take up about 7 feet by 7 feet by 3 feet as a pallet. It's a big amount. Is it possible? Yeah, it could be carried on those helicopters. But as the report says, boy, that's a lot of cash to take out at once with the number of people that were being transported as well. Could have been half of that, could have been a fraction. The report says it could have been as little as $500,000. What is undeniable is that the president of Afghanistan, when he fled the country, left $5 million in cash at the presidential palace, which was later loaded onto these bags and put into the trunks of cars that belonged to his official motorcade, and they left for areas unknown.
But some of it was left on the tarmac, is what I read, that they couldn't even fit it all in the helicopter, and they left some of it just laying on the ground.
And this is the thing I think that Matt will comment on and may agree. I've been to Afghanistan. I know it. Those officials, knowing the country was falling, they would have taken every last dollar that they could find. I talk about institutions and divisions here that had $39 million in cash, $70 million in cash, because they thought the country's falling. We're going to leave with whatever we can. If they left $5 million behind, some of it on the tarmac in the presidential palace, it's not because they decided to leave that for charity. It's because they could not cram it onto the helicopter. They had already put as much as they had on. And we're losing this story. We're losing any outrage over it because sometimes people are tired. They say, well, what do you expect? But the other thing, it's lost. It's sort of subsumed under the, the Trump Mar-a-Lago FBI search as well. Nothing gets covered anymore. And so, the officials who fled Afghanistan with American taxpayer money and aid money, they might well get away with it.
I talked to Mary Knox just briefly about the fact that I was going to do this show, and she had seen your article in Forbes, and one of her her comment was interesting. She said, "What the hell why did he get on Soviet helicopters?" I said, "Well, the U.S. was kind of busy at the time, and they stayed. They kept their embassy open. Maybe that's why. I don't know if that's correct or not." She said, "Well, where the hell did he go?" And I said, "Well, he's in the Arab Emirates. I mean, he fled down there. I don't know. Where did he go with the money, and why was he on a Soviet chopper?"
He was. Those Soviet choppers had been around for a while. They had them. That was the presidential entourage, their small fleet of helicopters. But the thing is, he went to Uzbekistan. That's where originally they went with all that cash. I'd love to know what the Uzbekistan fee was for entry into the country on that day. I'm sure that some money passed hands to make sure he had a safe landing.
That's great. Well, let me get back to the article here. I've got just a couple of more slides, and Matt, you can jump in here anytime you want to, but let me see here, get this back up on screen. All right. So, and the no curricular conclusions.
George, just one thing, by the way, there's a division inside Afghanistan, the National Directorate of Security. Its purpose is to pass around money to support anti-Taliban sort of militias and buy the loyalty of these big warlords. So it's flush with cash. It has an annual budget of about over $200 million, but tens of millions of that is in cash. Now, the report looked into that. And you know what they said in the end? This is fantastic. We can't really decide if any of that money was stolen because we, CGAR, the overview report, we never had access. We were never privy to that budget. But from media accounts, it suggests that the CIA has historically funded that division. So here's a great thing where American investigators who are given the task of finding out where the cash went at the end of the fall of Afghanistan are stymied in their look at one division that had tens of millions of dollars in cash that may have been stolen because they aren't given access to that division. But all they can repeat is the fact that the CIA may be the funding for it. This is where, Matt, you talked before about the fact that the Republicans say if they're going to get control of the House again, they want to reinvestigate Hunter Biden. Instead, look at this. Find out, where CIA money, which is taxpayer money, ends up being put into a division in the Afghan government and later stolen by Afghan officials, and none of it gets prosecuted. So that I'd be more interested in.
All right, let me see if I can get this back up on screen here. This goes to the, and this is the part that is so visual, you just jaw dropping. Skeptical it was that much, since the amount of cash would have been difficult to conceal. In $100 bills, it would have weighed nearly 2 tons. Gerald mentioned this now, and formed a block 7.5 feet deep, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet tall. Since the helicopters didn't have separate cargo holds, the cash would have been visible in the cabin next to the passengers. Since no eyewitnesses told Cigar they saw such a large block of money, the investigators are uncertain about the $160 million figure. That's a huge amount of money anyway.
So this is fantastic. So think of it. The people on the helicopter who are fleeing are the top officials in Afghanistan. The president of Afghanistan is fleeing the capital the day before the Taliban get in with other officials. They're carrying out with them as much cash as possible. Then later, American investigators come to them and say, by the way, we need to ask you, did you see a 7 foot by 3 foot by 7 foot pile of cash wrapped up on the helicopter that you were you sitting next to that? Nope, not me. No, did you see it? No, not me. And then that's how it's reported in the report. This report does not inspire any confidence in me at all when I'm reading it.
It's funny, but not really. My God, it's just incredible. And I always jump back and think, and we'll get into this very briefly, about all of the things that we don't have money for in this country, and what a huge amount of money this is. Now, one of the few matters on which the Cigar report is confident is that Ghani's private security guards, who were left behind in Kabul by his helicopters, they gathered about $5 million in cash at the presidential palace later that afternoon and put it in 4 large bags in the trunks of cars belonging to the president's motorcade. The Russian embassy in Kabul contended early on that the $5 million was left behind only because not all of it would fit in the helicopters, because they wouldn't have been able to get the passengers in. It would just been a $100 bill cargo plane, apparently. So, as Gerald says, the unsatisfying bottom line in this much anticipated report is that it remains a strong possibility that significant amounts of U.S. currency disappeared from Afghan government property in the chaos of the Taliban takeover, including millions from the presidential palace and the NDS vault. Attempts to loot other government funds appear to have been common, yet with Afghan government records and surveillance videos from those final days likely in a Taliban hand, Cigar was unable to determine how much money was ultimately stolen and by whom. Okay,
so the bottom line of this 1-year investigation by U.S. investigators was, we don't know.
My God. I mean, that's incredible. Matt, I guess you could comment just based on your experience there. This sounds like unbelievable criminal activity, but in historical perspective, this is kind of maybe not business as usual, but this is the world in Afghanistan.
Oh, we should be playing the clip from Casablanca right now. Shocked that gambling is occurring here. You know, it was 10 years ago, because I looked it up. It was 10 years ago that the Washington Post was reporting that $4.5 billion in cash was leaving Afghanistan every year through the Kabul airport. Just through the Kabul airport, $4.5 billion in cash was leaving, and that is roughly half of what Afghanistan's GDP was, I believe, at the time. So the other aspect is the why how widespread the smuggling was in terms of drugs, gems, other things. So there is an entire apparatus that was in place to get money out. Was not an issue. Maybe in this case it was a little more fanciful, because it had to be done so quickly because the Taliban were coming into town. You know, but certainly this is something that's been going on for decades. This war was a living legacy of the Cold War. You know, one of the things about the corruption that has not been fully addressed was just how much the drug trade was the Afghan military and the Afghan government. I mean, for decades, the American military was saying that the Taliban controlled the drug trade. And then, as is now being reported, and the United Nations is fessing up a bit about it, you know, when the American military would say that 60% of the Taliban's revenue came from the drug trade, it looks like it's really about 6%. And we knew that all along. I knew that when I was there in 2009. We knew that the drug trade was a minor source of revenue for them, that actually just them taxing things coming in out of the country, legal commerce was a much greater source of revenue. And of course, the greatest source of revenue for the Taliban were the Saudi, the Emirati, the Kuwaiti, the Qatari governments, the Pakistani governments, milking the American contracts that were in Afghanistan. But so there has been this corruption that has been in place in Afghanistan for decades that the United States government hasn't just turned a blind eye to, but has been complicit with and has sustained. These are crooks, so to say, right? I mean, and this was the same in the Iraq War, and that's in the Iraq War when I was on the Department of State team there. That's where I dealt with the cash. We could fit $6.5 million into a green Army duffel bag. So people are familiar with the 3-foot duffel bag with the straps on it. You can get about $6.5 million into one of those, and it's pretty heavy, but that's how it was there as well. The money was just all over the place. It was unaccounted for. There was a lot of, in my case, I can tell you what happened after I left. All the work we were doing, we would send our documents down to I was in Tikrit. We would send our documents down to Baghdad, as well as up to Kirkuk, because the finance people were in Baghdad and the contracting people were in Kirkuk. So I'd send documents to both places as well as keep records in Tikrit. A couple of years later, when I got interviewed by the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, and I told them, well, my documents were here, here, and here, they said there's no documents at all from those years, right? Through the whole country. So the whole thing, both wars were incredibly dirty, incredibly corrupt. And the money, whether it was the money that went right to major weapons and development and infrastructure contractors like, Lockheed or KBR or, whoever, Chemonics or companies like that, or just the cash that was being utilized. It was incredibly dirty. And this story about Ghani is, I think it's a fundamental truth about that war. That's how it ends, with the corrupt president fleeing in a helicopter with tons of cash, going to Uzbekistan and then going to the Emiratis or wherever he's at. Because again, that money had just been leaving for decades. And, and so it was as my friend Mike Ferner likes to say, even losing wars make money. And that was certainly the case with both the Iraq and Afghan wars.
Matt, you're absolutely right about the money having fled the country for years. It built up the skyline and part of Dubai, all the Afghans buying condos there. But in addition, the fact that they had upwards of 169 million in cash to get out on that day before the Kabul fell is pretty good evidence that the fall of Kabul was much faster than they expected.
Yes.
Because if it had been a little slower, they would have gotten it all out. It would have left on transports, on commercial planes going into the UAE. So the fact that so much was left meant it really picked up speed. There's also something great when you say the 3-foot duffel fits about $6.5 million and it's very heavy. I want everyone to remember that the next time they see a spy film or a James Bond film and somebody says, I have $20 million in this little attaché, it just doesn't work. That's the real story. The other thing is that about 10 years ago, the U.S. government tried to get these very sophisticated and costly currency counting machines into Kabul airport. Not only would it count the currency as we're used to, but they took pictures at a very, very fast rate, images of the serial numbers on the bills, because the U.S. wanted to make sure that the money that was being taken out belonged to some Chinese contractor who was trying to get a copper mine deal out in the eastern part of the country. These weren't U.S. aid dollars. And the Afghans finally, after a long resistance, put them at the airport, but disabled the feature of being able to do the serial number matches. Right. So they clearly were taking the money. The last thing is what Matt talked about before. The amount of cash used in both of these wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, to try to buy the loyalty of people. And guess what? Cash doesn't do it. It'll buy temporary compliance. It'll buy a friend for a while to work with you. But in the end, this is ideology. And if we aren't winning hearts and minds, we knew that from Vietnam. It's not cash that's winning hearts and minds. It's the philosophy of why you're there. If you think you're going to get allies who are going to be with you forever because you're giving them more money, when that money runs out, you've lost the ally as well.
Matt, as you reply, let me show this. These are a couple of photos here. I know Gerald hasn't seen these before. I haven't seen them before. I mean, this is the money that we're talking about, the duffel bag money, the millions of dollars that was just dropped over there. Tell us what we're seeing here.
So this is this would have been probably fall of 2004, paying some of our contractors to do construction work for us, build roads, bridges, schools, things like that. And the idea was that we would purchase the loyalty of those we were occupying by building things, which is just, if you take a few seconds to think about it, like, would that work here? No, it wouldn't. So why do we think it would work there? But we were spending hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars a week in cash, putting out into Crete. The contractors would show up just like you see there. You can see there the guy with the briefcase, and we would pay them every Friday. It was Friday because it was on their holy day, which for some reason we didn't think about when we did it. But I know it's just one more thing, right? Yeah. But every day at 11 a.m. or whatever time, they would come and they would line up, and then they would be let in one by one, and then they would leave the front gate of the base right in the center of the Crete with their hundreds of thousands of dollars. In some cases, sometimes they left with millions of dollars. They would leave it within a plastic bag. And we never heard about anyone ever getting robbed, right? I mean, so the whole thing was, but this idea was that we were going to use this money to purchase loyalty, that we were going to, in the parlance, that we were going to connect the people with the government. We would make the people see that backing the government through our occupation was a benefit for them because we were doing these things. We were building a water treatment facility. We were putting air conditioners in schools or what have you. The reality was as that money went into the economy, the insurgency worsened because, again, it was about the occupation. It's about what we were doing.
And very quickly, what Matt said is key. We had this idea of all these projects being done, roads being built, bridges, schools, air conditioning, all these things. The problem was that they never got done. The list of things where money just disappeared, where the road was half empty, where tarmac wasn't finished, where a school never got built. That's the real disgrace, is the follow-up. We weren't able to enforce it. So the money went out, and then the projects didn't get done. So it's a double whammy in many cases.
Schools became goat barns. Yeah. I mean, that's
and the Afghan inspector general did a much better job than the Iraq inspector general did. The Seagar guys are real. They're real heroes. They really are. And there are some journalists like Azmat Khan who also went and did some really hard work and found that in the case of all the thousands of schools and hundreds of public healthcare facilities we supposedly built in Afghanistan, you can't find 80 to 90% of them. They don't exist. Or if they were built, the GPS coordinates weren't put down correctly. And it was like this really great racket. And in Afghanistan, who did we put in power in 2001? We put the warlords back in power. And we expected for some reason not to behave like warlords. And so we just continued to put that money. These were also the same men who controlled the drug trade. And, this is why about this idea that I think, Gerald, you're exactly right about the fall of Kabul happening so quickly, because there were systems to get money out. No problem. Right. That was one of the things you go back. I mean, again, we're talking about my nephew's going to college next week. He's 18. Like, this stuff predates him. This is like ancient history to kids in college right now, but that's how long it went on for. So in the early part of our occupation in Afghanistan, we start trying to build up this Afghan Air Force. And the guy who's in charge of the Afghan Ministry of Defense is a guy named Marshal Fahim, who was a warlord, but also one of the 3 or 4 biggest drug lords in Afghanistan. And because he had actually been there had actually been some actual legal things with him, the United States government could not actually coordinate directly with him and talk with him. And there's a huge New York Times story from like 2004 about this, right? So this was never none of this ever went on in secret. It was always being talked about, exposed, and then just conveniently ignored. But in this case, you were giving one of the biggest drug lords in the world his own Air Force. And what do you think they were going to do with it? And what do you think they did with it? And that's exactly part of this, is that the corruption was so endemic, so widespread, and it was all out in the open. And we certainly knew about it on the inside. The intelligence was all there. We knew it and was just told to. And there were some tragedies. There were 6 or 7 Air Force service members who were killed in Afghanistan around 2011, 2012. And the understanding was that they were killed because they were going to go public about this, that they were going to resign and go public. And an Afghan killed them who was involved in the smuggling. I mean, and that kind of stuff, you know, whether or not that story is true or not, that's what we were hearing. That's what was told. Members of Congress believed that was true, but it doesn't get anywhere. You know, it doesn't kind of, and it doesn't then be able to create the mass or the
mass to become a story.
Exactly.
But, you know, Matt, one other quick thing to try to get in. I know we're nearing the end on time with George, but not to push his patience. But what you said a moment ago, that the Afghan Inspector General was much better than the Iraqi one in terms of uncovering things. And they were. Yeah. I follow them. I see their weekly reports, and they uncover corruption time and time again. They've been highlighting it for Congress. That's why this particular report issued just a few days ago, last week, about what about the missing cash at the end from Afghanistan is so disappointing. Because it's so atypical for the Afghan Inspector General. They don't pull punches normally, and on this one they had a dozen excuses to why they couldn't do it. So when you follow them, you know when they've come up short, and they're just not saying it for whatever reason. I don't know why.
Well, and as well too, you know, John Sopko is the name of the guy who's the Inspector General, and then his people, and they. What happens actually, it's kind of interesting because there's a guy named Arnie Fields who becomes the first Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. And he's a retired Marine Corps officer. And I knew him when he was over there in 2009 trying to get work done. And he was trying to do this type of work, really getting at the what's going on here. And the Pentagon rebelled against him, as well as the State Department and the USAID. And they got Claire McCaskill to get him removed, Senator Claire McCaskill to get him removed. And then they appointed Sopko. And for some reason, they thought Sopko would be more manageable. And they had already removed Fields, so they could never remove Sopko again. And Sopko, I think, saw what had been done to Fields and knew that he had to do things in a very thorough manner. But what Sopko is so successful, and you could see his success, because every year the Pentagon further classifies things to keep it out of Sopko's hands. Right. So when we're talking about like the effectiveness of the Afghan army, the billions of dollars spent training this Afghan army that, as we all saw last year, just folds in a matter of months. Well, Sopko was reporting on that for years. And every year the Department of Defense would say, well, no, you can't talk about that because that's now classified. Even though it wasn't classified this year, now it looks so bad, we're going to classify it. And so you see that success, and you see that Sopko really is kind of the portrait or what we should be trying to emulate throughout our government. You know, we just had this thing with the January 6th where the Inspector General for Homeland Security seems to have been the one who is blocking the text messages from being released and other things, and just like these criminal actions by those who are supposed to be catching the criminals. And, you know, Sopko, again, is a real American hero, and so are his people.
You're right. You know, you're right, Matt. But, you know, the interesting thing is that not only did the Pentagon tried to then declassify some of the information that they were relying on, but there was an ally for the Pentagon in terms of making sure the stories weren't covered, and that was the legacy press, the mainstream press, in large part. Because yes, you're right when you talk about that New York Times article in 2004, the Great Washington Post piece 10 years ago, but then the coverage really starts to fall off. You get an occasional piece about Afghanistan, but the special inspectors' reports, they weren't covered. Right. They didn't even make page 33 of the Times after a while. It was just another story about corruption. I would sometimes try to submit to a magazine a long-form story about a new aspect of what I viewed as this crumbling infrastructure that we had tried to build up with $1 trillion. And the reaction from editors invariably would be, well, no, it's not news. We know about it, but you don't know about it. And so the failure to cover it is one of the reasons I think the American public was so startled at the end. It was a paper tiger and fell so fast. But for those of us who were looking at it like yourself or George or, you know, others, we weren't surprised. It was just a question of when.
Right. When, you know, when you build a house of cards, it's going to come down. That's the reality. And that's what was there. I mean, you had a house of cards, and we saw the same thing happen in Iraq. I mean, in 2014, when the Iraqi army folds, because the Iraqi army was a business. You want to be a battalion commander, you purchased that position, and then you taxed those below you to pay for the purchase. You want to be a regimental commander, you want to be a division commander. All those positions were, you could purchase them. And that's the way the Iraqi army had been stood up and formed under the U.S. government. And so in 2014, when the Iraqi army just collapses and there's no investigation, no uproar, There, of course, was the political tax on Obama. But, in sense of like what had happened here, what have we done for all these years? And then more or less the same thing occurs in Afghanistan last year. And no, and that's the reality of it, though. There'll be, as you were saying, Gerald, there'll be investigations into, Hunter Biden. There'll be investigations into, whatever. But where are the investigations into, these wars? Where are the investigations into the opioid, epidemic? Where are the investigations into our pandemic response, et cetera, et cetera?
No, I agree. I mean, every day I'm looking at the fentanyl numbers, and they're going up over 100,000 dead, and the amount of fentanyl coming into the country with, Chinese precursor chemicals coming in, Mexican labs making the cartel coming over. And I don't even hear talk, at least you get some political talk normally about we'll fight the war against drugs, and even whatever that means, but you don't get it here. And one of the things that's so amazing is you would think that in terms of history, but I guess we don't look at history that much. We should know as a nation that insurgencies are impossible to stop. The French learned that in Algeria years, for decades and decades ago. We learned that in Indochina. In terms of Vietnam, you should learn. I mean, the insurgencies that came up in Iraq and later in Afghanistan were these homebred insurgencies of real, true believers, mixed with religion in some cases. And I'll tell you that if you're just dealing to try to stop that by funding it with a lot of money and arms, and as you say, selling the positions for military positions, you're never going to be able to hold on to that. And somehow the leaders of our country and our military leaders convince themselves that this time is different. Oh, every other one in history has failed, but this time we'll get it right. And it just doesn't turn out to be that way. It's a tremendous waste and expenditure of treasure, human treasure in terms of lives, and real treasure in terms of money. And we end up back at the same spot or worse.
Yeah, it's a mix of arrogance and ambition, I feel, among them. This idea that it can be done better, and I'm the guy who's going to do it better this time, right? That's right. But in the history, hey, I'm in North Carolina, and we have, and throughout the country, not just confined to the South, but you have plenty of people who the spirit of the Civil War still runs in their blood, who fly the flag, who believe in the noble cause. It is. These things are currents of history that, particularly when you then are able to mix them with race, religion, occupation. And this is what we see, in some of the framework for the most extreme of the groups, the Al-Qaeda, the Islamic States, et cetera. The conversation eventually leads you back to the Crusades. And they see this as a continuation of that, and that animates people. It gives them a purpose. It gives them a destiny. It connects them with their forefathers, right? That's one of the things we ran against, fighting the Afghans, who probably the best light infantry in the world. You're fighting against guys that their fathers fought and their grandfathers fought, and they beat the Soviets, kind of thing. And then you go back and their great grandfathers defeated the British. So there's a lineage. I remember being at this Independence Day celebration in Afghanistan, where they were celebrating slaughtering the British. The Afghans were all dancing, and I had some British counterparts who were kind of like, "Should we be here?"
Alexander the Great ended his empire.
Oh, God.
Into Afghanistan from Dubai. When I took that flight on Afghan Air, the first time. You fly over the mountain ranges, that are around the country. And I realized bin Laden was still alive at that point. We didn't know where he was. But I thought to myself, because those mountains go on forever, you think if he's there, we're never going to find him.
Oh, yeah. And interesting just to finish up with just the last thing on history and how we just don't seem to connect the dots, even though in our own terminology we do. Our spirit of a revolution, World War II, all these things animate us. But where I was in Afghanistan, in the southeast of Afghanistan, a province called Zabul, there was a fort there that supposedly was from Alexander Great's time, one of his farthest east outposts. And we used that. The Americans used that as a base. And we would talk about, does that make sense to be there? Because the image of the foreigners occupying the foreign army base that you all take such pride in as having stood up against and limited Alexander's advance, stopped his advance. What type of narrative are we fitting here? What type of messaging are we just fitting into the messaging of the insurgency, who is their primary messaging was never about religion. It was always about occupation, you know, and yeah.
Like I always say, you'll never know where you are. You don't know where you're headed if you don't know where you've been.
Yeah.
And so it's great to talk about history here, but I want to bring us back to the modern time, or at least this century anyway. Let me bring this in. I just love having these guys on the show. Again, Matthew Hoh, he's a U.S. Marine. He's running for the Green Party ticket, the U.S. Senate out of North Carolina. And, of course, our friend Gerald Posner, award-winning author, and he's been on the show before, and he's just authored this great article in Forbes. He's got a Substack. We've talked about that. One of the I like these exclusives, so this is an exclusive to me. I had this photo up earlier. We've got some, thousands of dollars out on the table here. Matt, tell us what this is now, because this is getting and this is going to take a segue to the next segment here that we'll wrap up with.
But that was $2.6 million, if I remember correctly. A gentleman was doing a whole lot of road construction, and and that program that we had there was done. We were pretty successful in terms of getting work done, because we were doing it through the local Iraqi ministries. But even still, there was a tremendous amount of corruption, a lot of stuff that got done. Later became undone. There was the comedy of, like, we would pave a road and then a big USAID contractor would come in and rip it up and put water pipes in. I mean, there are things like that. But then the overall, you're doing all this, and particularly some of our work, like when we were doing electrification and water treatment, you're always with the knowledge that we're rebuilding this because we destroyed it. And the Iraqis know that, But anyway, that was the most we ever had. That was about a $50 million program, all done in cash, that came out of the Iraqi, the frozen Iraqi funds, the money, the oil for food program, and some other monies that have been seized by the United States, the United Nations, that was originally Iraqi money. So that wasn't American taxpayer money, although there was about $16 billion at least allocated by the U.S. Congress in 2004, I believe, for Iraqi reconstruction. That number went up. Certainly the amounts that were spent in Afghanistan exceeded $100 billion, and a lot of it was in cash. A lot of it wasn't, properly accounted for. There's a lot of things were dirty. In my sense, just to give you an idea of what we're dealing with, the most I ever had in my possession at one time was about $26 million. I had 2 safes in the bedroom I slept in, and just $26 million in cash, all $100 bills, all straight from the Federal Reserve. They come shrink wrapped. Numbers are all serialized. And and that's what we did. And used to travel around with a protective team, and I'd have a pistol in my pocket, and he's like, "You're a Scarface." And this idea of what we were going to win over the population by building things and paying out money. And we would use the money to purchase loyalty. To even go further than that, we would make sure that the money went to certain people that we thought would have an impact politically in certain areas. So we were using that money to purchase political allegiance. But the reality is, again, the occupation had much more an effect than certainly trying to rebuild the things that we destroyed previously.
And one of the interesting things, as a sidelight, is there isn't a single instance that I know of, Matt, you may know otherwise, in Iraq. I know certainly in Afghanistan, in which a military convoy or a group of soldiers who had millions of dollars to distribute in a local village, or to warlords or to political leaders, was ambushed and the money was stolen. There was no great train robbery, no great Brinks robbery or that at gunpoint. Right. A lot of people were walking around with AKs in Afghanistan. And that's because the people we were paying were the power brokers. They were the local warlords, and that nobody would steal their money. It wasn't as though you were stealing U.S. money. People knew where it was going. So it's interesting that as a result, it was being funneled to the people who had the ability to affect the way Afghanistan played out. But at the same time, and in Afghanistan, without any oil, no food programs for oil. There was no oil revenue coming in, nothing to offset the fact that the taxpayer and U.S. aid money was really the bulk of it.
Yeah, and two quick stories. In Iraq, I was pretty well known among the population as American. I would show up at provincial council meetings. I'd be out in the public. People would see me. I was civilian, so I wasn't in uniform. And we knew that there were bounties on certain members of the occupation there, certain leaders, whether it be certain officers or some of my civilian counterparts had bounties on them. And I asked my Iraqi counterpart, the guy I worked with all the time, do I have a bounty? you know? And he said, no. And I was disappointed. Right. I mean, like, come on, that means I'm not important. And he said, no, the reason why is because everyone likes you. You're the guy with the money, you know? And is because I was paying off the right people and that money went to the people it needed to go to, including the insurgency. You really saw this hammer home in Afghanistan, because in Afghanistan, go out and I visit these very small bases where there'd be a platoon of American soldiers and maybe a platoon of Afghan soldiers. I mean, these were always under strength. You're talking about 40 or 50 total troops in this little base, middle of nowhere, completely separated from any other American or allied forces that could come to help, and very easily could be overwhelmed by the Taliban. And, you know, came to realize there are two reasons why the Afghans didn't mass and attack those bases and overwhelm them. One is because of American air power. If they massed, then our air power could strike them, right? The other was that each of those little bases was giving out $1 million or $2 million a year in cash. And it was just a pump. It was a well for that area. So the insurgency was not going to do anything to jeopardize the money it was making off of all of our contracts, because what would happen, even in the best of circumstances, if you paid a guy somebody who to build a school or to dig a well or do whatever, his cousin was probably in the Taliban. I can tell you that in the province I was in Zabul, the guy who was head of the schools, his brother was a well-known Taliban commander in Wardak province, 2 provinces over, right? And so when teachers didn't get their pay, where do you think that money had gone to?
No question.
We all knew this, and we went along with it. And
in the eastern part of the country, many of the projects that were done had an element that were controlled by the Haqqani family. The Haqqanis are like a crime syndicate. They happen to be Islamist fundamentalists who are also a crime syndicate, and they got slices of that American money by having a role in many of those construction projects. So, the money was ending up in the wrong hands as well.
Okay, so I gotta get wrapped up here. My God, it's really great for these guys to stick around this long. Let's go big here. I want to get the overarching thing here. We're talking about cost here. Sometimes on the local level, we're talking about all of this bribery and corruption internally in Afghanistan. Let's talk about the cost of the war. And I would encourage everybody to go check out even the cliff notes on the Washington Post article, the Afghan papers, because it proves conclusively beyond a shadow of a doubt that we did not know what the hell we were doing in the war, and we did not know what we were spending money on. Now, the best little synopsis that I have of this that I like, I want to bring this up because it only takes a minute and it's better than me doing it. And just watch this. We'll come right back.
$300 million a day for 2 decades. I refuse to send another generation of America's sons and daughters to fight a war that should have ended long ago.
Researchers at Brown University have estimated that the 20-year conflict cost more than $2.3 trillion. They say that's a conservative best estimate through fiscal year 2022. And that includes big ticket items like direct military spending on the invasion and the occupation. We spent more than $80 billion, for example, training and equipping Afghan security forces. The total also includes the costs up through now of, for example, medical care and disability payments for veterans, but it doesn't include the future costs of that care. The U.S. spent a huge amount of money on what some would call nation-building efforts. For example, we built schools, hospitals, military bases. The U.S. also wasted billions of dollars on projects that either, faltered or were rife with corruption and abuse. As well documented by a special government watchdog who has uncovered failures in the spending. One small thing that he highlighted, for example, was that the U.S. spent billions of dollars on counter-narcotics efforts in an unsuccessful effort to stamp out the opium production in Afghanistan, which remains the world's largest source of heroin. I think we will be taking stock of the full universe of costs of the war for years to come.
Okay, folks.
One thing to say, yes, there's no question that the cost, the financial cost is terrible. But I must also say, I'm still in touch with Afghans, some of whom are trying to get out, who had helped American forces, and they're trying to get out into the special visa program. But I'm in touch also with some women who had been journalists in the last 20 years. And there was this period, this renaissance almost like to pre-Taliban period, where Afghan women felt freer and where young Afghan girls were able to go to school. There were things that were good while we were there in what you call this occupation math. There were things that happened as a result of that moved toward liberalization. And what's happened since, with the bans on women going to school and girls going to school, and that it's unfortunate because not only did we quote unquote lose the war and this 2.3 trillion, but even the good social things that had been done, they're footnotes now in history.
Exactly. And the $2.3 trillion, now that's conservatively speaking that they put in there. I mean, that's, oh my God, that's hard to imagine. And I've talked about this stack of $100 bills between Des Moines and Omaha. That's about $2.3 trillion, folks. That's what it is. $1 trillion is a stack of $1 trillion, or a stack of $100 bills, 67 miles high. So that's the kind of money that was spent in Afghanistan. And I reflect back on what Mary Knox, the admin on Facebook, one of the things that she mentioned was Afghanistan is no better now than it was when we went in there. And Matt, a lot of people might say it's worse. So what's your analysis? Is it worse than when we went in, or is it about the same, or maybe a little better?
First, with the numbers, so that was from the Cost of War project at Brown University, and they do some of the best work out there. And I know their number total for the Iraq and Afghan wars is $7 trillion, and that includes future expenses, veterans care, but also too the debt and interest payments on these wars. If you were to, if the debt and interest payments for military spending, war spending, intelligence spending, everything else, where it's its own separate government agency, it would be the third biggest agency by budget in the federal government after the Pentagon, after the Veterans Affairs Department. The United States spends about $170 billion a year on debt and interest payments for past military spending. And so we've already spent over $1 trillion on debt and interest payments for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's only going to continue to grow. And then VA healthcare costs, everything else. So that's what they say. It's $7 trillion is what they're trying. I mean, it's and then how, of course, do you calculate opportunity cost, right? I mean, how do you figure out what we could have done differently, yes. Right? I mean, but I go back to that Ron Placone quote he put up about Trump and the FBI and the Espionage Act, and like all those things can be true. And, Afghanistan, the difference between the war in the urban area, particularly in the north or in Kabul, and the war in the south and the east was dramatic. Azmat Khan, again, one of the best journalists out there. She's at Columbia University now. Her and Anand Gopal as well. Some of their reporting they did last year, really illuminated how vicious the war was in the south and in the east of the country. In Azmat's case, where she went to villages and spent months in the south, visiting with villagers, documenting what had occurred, she found that the average family lost 9 people. I believe it was 9 people throughout the war. The average family, most of them from airstrikes. So the reality for the war in the South was different for those so that's why I say both things can be true. Both the Taliban can be awful and the Afghan government we supported could be corrupt, brutal, vicious warlords and drug lords. I mean, both things can be true. The only thing we're supporting in that war were the Afghan people and the two sides. And that's ultimately what the American policy came down to for decades in Afghanistan, was like through the point of a barrel, trying to force people to either support the Taliban or support this thuggish kleptocracy. Yep. And what we saw happen, in my estimation, of the last year, because the Taliban advance was so quick and they took many provinces. And interesting, the first provinces they took were the provinces that didn't have historical support for the Taliban, non-Pashtun provinces, because the Taliban are really a Pashtun organization, So the provinces that first fell to the Taliban last year were non-Pashtun provinces. And it wasn't as if I don't think that people were rushing forward and embracing the Taliban and everything, but they weren't standing in their way because they have been so victimized by the government and by the warlords that were in power that they saw the Taliban as a better alternative, or at least a not worse alternative. And this, again, has parallels to what happens in the mid-90s when the Taliban come to power, because the people see the Taliban not as liberators or anything, but bringing about some form of law and order, some type of rule, bring about justice and at least security, which is after the decade and a half of war with the Soviets and then the Civil War, they were desperate for. And so you continue to see the people of Afghanistan just being given really terrible choices. And yeah, I mean, neither is, so it is, it's complicated. And certainly, yeah, there were benefits over the last 20 years. And I know plenty of Afghans, just as Gerald does, who had to flee, or who are, still there and living lives that are ruinous, terrible, horrific, scary lives.
And Matt, just in wrapping up, I mean, one thing, it's often the choice of the lesser of two evils. You don't often get to back the better of the groups. And it's so interesting. You're right. The social movements that lead to these revolutionary changes has led to the change in Iran. We started off the program talking about the Iranian government. The Ayatollah comes in because of the corruption of the Shah, and the people were, and there was this large segment that believed that it was time for cleansing. And now you have sort of, the inkling of maybe after 30 years, there is some feeling that maybe it's too restrictive. How long can the clerics hold on? We don't know. But, it's those social movements that come based upon a lot of pent up frustration. And there's no doubt, you're right, there was a lot of pent up frustration across Afghanistan among ordinary people that the government had failed them. And therefore, there was no real resistance to the Taliban. And we paid the price for that.
Right.
I just looked at the clock. We're at an hour and a half. Honest to God, I'm just thrilled to be able to spend this amount of time with our two guests. And I guess just any final thoughts here, anything that you want to say that I didn't ask about. Don't be hesitant to mention, like Matthew Hoh for Senate.org, places like that. I mean, let's do some official business, some house cleaning here at the end.
I guess, I was just reminded of a story, though, from my time in Baghdad, working with a young woman who was working in one of the Iraqi ministries, and the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which was an Iranian group had been in exile in Iran, and so it was an Iranian-backed group and had been opposed to Saddam Hussein for all those years. And so we put a lot of those people in power when we took over there in 2003. And I remember just the despair, the dismay in terms of that we have replaced the Baathists with these people. As she said, they tell me I'm not allowed to wear makeup, but they steal. Like that type of dismay, that type of despair, I think exists across countries, and including here. And I think that's why when we get back to this issue of third parties, independent candidates, the idea of trying to offer some kind of alternative, because, just talking to a guy the other night, he said, I don't know much about politics, but I know what's happening. It ain't working, and so that's, we're trying to do with the campaign, try and provide some form of alternative. People want to support, please go to MatthewHoh.org. And yeah, I really appreciate this, George, and Gerald. Is absolutely really fantastic to be here with you.
Matt, I look forward to see your election results coming up. I'm wishing you good luck. And my closing thought is, if you, for anybody listening to this, if you haven't heard enough about Afghanistan or the Iranians or Rushdie or independent third-party politics, also take a look at my articles that I broke in May on Forbes about the Biden administration's negotiations to swap Brittany Griner for Victor Bout, the arms trader, and an interview I had with the judge that on Substack that sentenced Bout, that thinks that we should make that trade. So if you want a break for the weekend, there's a little bit of material that I've covered on that as well, and have fun with it. All right. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's great, guys. And I guess my final thought would be, and we didn't get to a lot of this. We did mention the fact that that the United States is still supporting Afghanistan, still leading the way and sending some money in there. And it's in, the categories of tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. But again, remember the fact that we spent $2.3 trillion in a lot of ways blowing the damn thing up. I mean, it was not a successful endeavor. That did not work. If we can spend $2.3 trillion, which is $300 million a day over 20 years, then yeah, spending. And look at that photo. I mean, this is out of the United Nations. This is what they're dealing with over there. People can read through this. We're not going to be able to get to it today. I just wanted to bring it up on screen, but they've got a drought there. just like we do where I live here in the United States. There are an unbelievable number of Afghanis that are starving to death. Matt, I know that you're well aware of that. And this financial aid that needs to be forthcoming, it can be a lot because we've spent a lot. We've apparently got a lot when it comes to war. Let's spend some to keep people alive. And that would be my closing thought. Guys, thanks again. We'll get back to this. Maybe we'll have a part 2, but I just can't. I feel guilty going this long with such esteemed guests. Matthew Hoh and Gerald Posner, thanks again for coming on this Podcast by George live line.
Thank you both.
All right, thank you.
And folks, if you like a Podcast by George, I'll leave you with the closing remark, the wrap up that I always do. Go to podcastbygeorge.com. You saw those URLs, those web addresses that I had up earlier. MatthewHohforSenate.org for his Green Party candidacy in North Carolina. God, would that make a difference in the way business is done in Washington, D.C. And of course, Gerald Posner. He spent a lifetime revealing, pulling back the curtain, letting us have a look at Oz, the controls, what's going on behind the scene. Go to Posner.com and check him out. Buy some of those books. I got them. I mean, they are great reads. But folks, for us, go to podcastbygeorge.com, pick an icon, watch it on YouTube, watch it on Facebook, listen to us on iTunes, Spotify, Deezer, the iHeartRadio app, and places like that. But that's going to do it. That is going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast. Bye.